Hello?
Danye, this Liddy, why y'all didn't pull up? And that concludes the Liddy.
Breaking news, a young mother who was just days away from giving birth was shot and killed this morning while in her own bed.
12 gunshots through a bedroom window at 5:45 in the morning. And on the other side of that glass, a woman who was 2 weeks away from holding her son for the first time. She never got the chance. Neither did he. What makes this case so unsettling isn't just the violence. It's the precision of it. Someone knew exactly which window to shoot. Someone knew exactly who was sleeping behind it, and exactly what time she'd be there. This wasn't chaos. This was calculation. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what kind of mind is capable of that kind of planning against someone he was supposed to love. Before we go further, I need to ask you for something. This channel exists because of stories like this one. Stories that deserve to be told with care, not just clickbait. If you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on that bell, because these cases deserve to be followed all the way through, not just watched once and forgotten. Every like, every comment, every share tells YouTube that stories like Shakiya's matter, that her life and her son's life meant something. So if this reaches you, please take 15 seconds and support that. It genuinely costs you nothing, and it means everything to keeping these stories alive. Now, let's get into it. Shakiya Pridgen was 23 years old. She lived in DeKalb County, Georgia, in an apartment on Pepper Tree Circle, and by every account her family has given, she was the kind of person who held her world together quietly and without complaint. She was already a mother of two, a 1-year-old son and a 3-year-old daughter, and she was 9 months pregnant with a third child, a boy she had already named, Kyren, just 4 days before she died. She stood at a baby shower surrounded by people who loved her, celebrating a life that hadn't even started yet. Relatives describe her as dependable in a way that goes beyond the usual eulogy language. One family member told a local outlet that they could count on her for anything their kids needed. Another called her their earth angel. That kind of language tells you something about her role in the family structure. She wasn't peripheral. She was central. She was the person other people leaned on. That detail matters more than it might seem. In domestic violence psychology, victims who are highly relied upon by their families, who function as emotional or logistical anchors for others, often carry an added burden of silence. They're less likely to disclose what's happening to them because they don't want to become one more problem for people who already depend on them for stability. We don't know for certain that this applies to Shakiya specifically, but it's a pattern worth holding in mind as we go through what happened next. Now, let's talk about the night itself, because the sequence of events here is chilling in its ordinariness right up until the moment it isn't. It was just before 6 in the morning. Shakiya was asleep in her bed. Beside her were her 2 young children, her 1-year-old son and her 3-year-old daughter. It was an ordinary configuration for a mother days away from delivering a third baby. Tired, cautious, probably not sleeping well even before anything happened. Then, through the bedroom window, someone opened fire. Investigators say roughly a dozen rounds were fired into that window from outside the apartment. Shakiya was struck multiple times. Her children, remarkably and almost inexplicably, were not hit. Police responded quickly. She was rushed to the hospital, but the injuries were too severe. She died there, and so did her unborn son. Now here's where the psychological complexity of this case really starts to build, because this wasn't a stray bullet situation. This wasn't gang crossfire or a robbery gone wrong or a random act of urban violence. The kind of tragic but explicable event that news cycles absorb and move past quickly. Family members who spoke to investigators were adamant that this attack had signatures of intention behind it. They believed the shooter knew Shakiya's routine. They believed he knew precisely which window corresponded to her bedroom. They believed he knew she'd be sleeping there, in that exact spot, at that exact hour, with her children beside her. Let that sink in for a second. If that's true, and I want to be clear, this is the family's characterization, not a confirmed forensic conclusion, then this was not an impulsive act of rage. This was surveillance. This was patience. This was someone who had either watched this apartment or who had intimate insider knowledge of the household's nightly rhythm. That distinction between a crime of passion and a crime of premeditation is one of the most important things we look at when trying to understand an offender's psychology. Impulsive violence tells you about someone's emotional regulation, about a person who snapped under pressure. Premeditated violence tells you something colder. It tells you about someone capable of suppressing emotional urgency long enough to plan, to wait, to choose a moment. That kind of control, layered on top of lethal intent, is one of the more disturbing profiles in criminal psychology because it suggests a person functioned normally in daily life right up until they didn't. So, who did they believe was behind this? Investigators, working with the U.S. Marshals Service, identified 26-year-old Devin Anthony as a suspect. He was located and arrested at a residence in Riverdale, Georgia, some distance from the scene of the shooting. According to family members, Anthony was believed to be the father of Shakiya's unborn son. Now pause on that for a moment, because if that relationship detail is accurate, it reframes the entire case. This isn't a story about a stranger. This is potentially a story about an intimate partner, someone who is going to become, biologically at least, a father in a matter of weeks. And instead of that role, prosecutors allege he became the person responsible for ending that child's life before it began, and the life of the mother carrying him. This is where the psychology of intimate partner violence becomes essential to understanding this case. Pregnancy is one of the highest risk periods for intimate partner homicide. That's not speculation. That's something reflected consistently in domestic violence research. Pregnancy can escalate existing control dynamics in a relationship. It introduces new stressors, financial pressure, identity shifts, fear, commitment. And in relationships where coercive control already exists, the added presence of a child can feel to an abuser like a loss of dominance rather than a joyful expansion of family. The abuser may feel trapped, financially obligated, or publicly exposed by an approaching birth that will make the relationship, and any prior denial of it, undeniable. We are not saying that's what happened here. We don't have confirmed details about the nature of the relationship between Shakiya and Devin Anthony, how long it lasted, what state it was in, or what led to this moment. What we do have is a pattern that shows up again and again in cases where pregnant women are killed by partners. An allegation from the victim's own family that they believe the shooter knew her intimately enough to know exactly where she slept. Now here's the part of this case that I think deserves the most attention, because it isn't about the night of the shooting at all. It's about what came before it. Court records show that Devin Anthony was not new to the criminal justice system. Back in September 2021, he was indicted by a Fulton County grand jury for murder in connection with a separate shooting death. That is a serious charge, one that in most cases carries the weight of a life sentence if convicted at trial. But that's not what happened. Anthony accepted a negotiated plea deal under Georgia's First Offender Act, a legal provision designed to give people without a prior criminal record a chance to avoid a permanent felony conviction if they complete their sentence successfully. Under that deal, his murder charge was reduced to manslaughter. He was sentenced to 20 years. But those 20 years, he was ordered to serve only 11 months in custody. The remainder was probation, 11 months, for a case that began as a murder indictment. I want you to sit with that number for a second, because it's the hinge point of this entire story. If the allegations against Anthony and Shakiya's case are proven true, then a system built to give people a second chance may have handed a violent offender exactly the window of freedom he needed to find himself back in a position to kill again. This isn't necessarily a story about one man's individual descent into violence. It might be a story about how legal mechanisms designed for rehabilitation can, in certain cases, fail catastrophically to account for ongoing risk. Shakiya's family seemed to sense this immediately. One relative said it plainly. He got a second chance. Shakiya doesn't get a second chance, and he shouldn't be allowed a third to do this to somebody else. That's not just grief talking. That's a direct indictment of a justice process that, in hindsight, looks like it may have underestimated exactly who it was dealing with. Anthony is now facing charges of murder, feticide, and aggravated assault with intent to murder. He's being held without bond. The investigation is ongoing, and as of now, the full picture of what happened in the relationship between him and Shakiya, what led up to that morning, whether there were warning signs anyone missed, remains incomplete. Police have not publicly confirmed every detail the family has alleged, including the exact nature of his connection to her, or the specifics of how the shooting was carried out beyond what emergency responders observed at the scene. But here's what we do know for certain. A 23-year-old mother of two, 9 months pregnant with a son she had already named, was killed while sleeping beside her children. The person accused of doing it had already been through the system once for an eerily similar act and walked away with less than a year served. So I want to ask you something, because this is where I think the real conversation about this case begins. What does it take for a legal system to treat a violent indictment as an aberration rather than a warning sign? At what point does a plea deal designed for mercy start functioning instead as a loophole for the truly dangerous? And on a more personal level, if someone in your life had a history like this, would you see the red flags before it was too late, or would love, habit, or hope make you explain them away, the same way we often do for people we're closest to? And maybe the hardest question of all, how do you reconcile the image of a man who was, by family accounts, about to become a father, with the accusation that he orchestrated the death of that same child before it ever took its first breath? Is that a contradiction? Or is it exactly the kind of psychological split that lets abusers function normally in public while harboring something entirely different underneath? I want to know what you think. Drop your theory in the comments. Do you think this was premeditated from the start? Or do you think something happened in the days leading up to it that pushed things to this point? Do you think the plea deal in 2021 is the real story here, more than the shooting itself? If this case moved you, if you think stories like Shakiya's deserve to be understood and not just reported, then subscribe to Psychology of Crime. We're not here for shock value. We're here to understand the minds behind these headlines, one case at a time. I'll see you in the next one.